Why, you'd start your fire over that way, and then you'd never let it go out. Everybody that amounted to anything knew how to make the hearth fire with ashes at night so that it would be sure to last all night long. And the first thing in the morning, you got down on your knees and poked the ashes away very carefully till you got to the hot coals. Then you'd blow with the bellows and drop in pieces of dry pine. Oh, don't forget the water glasses. And you'd blow gently until they flared up and shavings caught, and there your fire would be kindled again. The napkins are in the second drawer. Betsy went on setting the table deep in thought, reconstructing the old life. As she put the napkins around, she said, "But sometimes it must have gone out." "Oh, yes," said Aunt Abigail. "Sometimes it did go out, and then one of the children was sent over to the nearest neighbor to borrow some fire. He'd take a covered iron pan fastened onto a long hickory stick and go through the woods, everything was woods back then, to the next house and wait until they had their fire going and could spare him a pan full of coals. And then, oh, don't forget the salt and pepper, then he would leg it as fast home as he could, streak, and get there before the coals went out. Say, Betsy, I think that applesauce is ready to be sweetened. You do it, will you? I've got my hands in the biscuit dough. The sugar's there on the left-hand drawer in the kitchen cabinet." "Oh, my," cried Betsy, dismayed. "I don't know how to cook." Aunt Abigail laughed and put back a strand of curly white hair with the back of her floury hand. "Well, you know how to stir sugar into your cup of cocoa, don't you?" "Well, but how much should I put in?" asked Elizabeth Ann, clamoring for exact instruction so that she wouldn't need to do any thinking for herself. "Just do it till it tastes right," said Aunt Abigail carelessly. "Fix it to suit yourself, and I guess the rest of us will like it. Take that big spoon to stir it with." Elizabeth Ann took the lid off and began stirring in sugar, a teaspoonful at a time, but she soon saw that it made no impression. So she poured in a cupful, stirred it vigorously, and tasted it. Better, but still not quite enough. She put in a heaping tablespoon more and tasted it, staring off into space as she concentrated her attention on the taste. It was quite a responsibility to prepare the applesauce for a family. It was ever so good, too, but maybe a little more sugar. She put in a teaspoonful and decided that that was exactly right. "Done?" asked Aunt Abigail. "Take it off then and pour it in that big yellow bowl and put it on the table in front of your plate. You made it, so you ought to serve it." "Well, it isn't done, is it?" asked Elizabeth Ann, very much surprised. "I didn't know it was so easy to cook." "Easiest thing in the world," said Aunt Abigail gravely, with the merry wrinkles around her merry old eyes all creased up with silent fun. When Uncle Henry came back from the barn with old Shep at his heels, and Cousin Ann came down from upstairs where her sewing machine had been humming like a big bee, they were both duly impressed when told that Betsy had set the table and made the applesauce. They pronounced it very good applesauce indeed, and each sent his saucer back to the little girl for a second helping. She herself ate 3 saucers full. Her own private opinion was, it was the very best applesauce ever made. After supper was over and the dishes washed and wiped, Betsy helped with the putting away. The 4 gathered around the big lamp on the table with the red cover. Cousin Ann was making some buttonholes on the shirtwaist that she had constructed that afternoon. Aunt Abigail was darning socks, and Uncle Henry was mending a piece of harness. Shep lay on the couch and snored until he got so noisy that they couldn't stand it, and Cousin Ann poked him in the ribs, and he woke up snorting and gurgling and looking around sheepishly. Every time this happened it made Betsy laugh. She held Eleanor, who didn't snore at all but made the prettiest tea-kettle singing purr deep in her throat, and opened and sheathed her needle-like claws in Betsy's dress. "Well, how'd you get on at school?" asked Uncle Henry. "I've got your desk," said Elizabeth Ann, looking at him curiously, at his gray hair and wrinkled, weather-beaten face, trying to think what he must have looked like when he was a little boy like Ralph. "So," said Uncle Henry, "well, let me tell you that's a mighty good desk. Did you notice the deep groove in the top of it?" Betsy nodded. She had wondered what that was used for. "Well, that was the lead pencil desk in the old days, when they couldn't run down to the store to buy things because there wasn't any store to run to. How do you suppose they got their lead pencils?" Elizabeth Ann shook her head, incapable of making a guess. She had never thought before that there could have been pencils, that lead pencils grew. Excuse me. She had never thought before but that lead pencils grew in a glass showcase in stores. Well, sir, said Uncle Henry, I'll tell you. They took a piece of lump of lead that they made their bullets of and melted it over the fire in the hearth down at the schoolhouse till it would run like water. And then they poured it into that groove. When it cooled off, there was a long streak of solid lead, about as big as one of our lead pencils nowadays. And they'd break that up in shorter lengths, and there you'd have your lead pencils, made while you wait. I tell you, in the old days, folks knew how to take care of themselves more than now. Why, weren't there any stores? Asked Elizabeth. She could not imagine living without buying things at stores. Where'd they get the things to put us in stores in those days? Asked Uncle Henry, argumentatively. Every single thing had to be lugged clear from Albany or from Connecticut on horseback. Why didn't they use wagons? Asked Elizabeth Ann. Well, you can't run a wagon unless you've got a road to run it on, can you? Said Uncle Henry. It was a long, long time before they had any roads. It's an awful chore to make up roads in a new country, all woods and hills and swamps and rocks. Why, you're lucky if there's a good path from your house to the next settlement. Now, Henry, said Aunt Abigail, do stop going on about old times long enough to let Betsy answer the question you ask her. You haven't given her a chance to say how she got on at school. Well, I am awfully mixed up, said Betsy complainingly. I don't know what I am. I'm second grade arithmetic, third grade spelling, and seventh grade reading, and I don't know what in writing or composition because we didn't have those. Nobody seemed to think this was very remarkable or even very interesting. Uncle Henry indeed noted only to say, seventh grade reading. He turned to Aunt Abigail. Oh, Mother, don't you suppose she could read out loud to us evenings? Aunt Abigail and Cousin Ann both laid down their sewing to laugh. Yes, yes, Father, and play checkers with you too, like as not. They explained to Betsy, your Uncle Henry is just as daft about being read aloud to when he's got something to do in the evening, and when he hasn't, he's as fidgety as a broody hen if he can't play checkers. Ann hates checkers, and I haven't got the time. Often. Oh, I love to play checkers, said Betsy. Well, now, said Uncle Henry, rising instantly and dropping his half-mended harness on the table. Let's have a game. Oh, Father, said Cousin Ann, in the same tone she used for Shep. How about that piece of breeching? You know that's not safe. Why don't you finish that up first? Uncle Henry sat down again, looking as Shep did when Cousin Ann told him to lie on the couch, and he took up his needle and awl. But I could read something aloud, said Betsy, feeling very sorry for him. At least I think I could. I never did except at school. Oh, what shall we have, Mother? Asked Uncle Henry eagerly. I don't know. What have we got in this bookcase? Said Aunt Abigail. It's pretty cold to go into the parlor for the other one. She leaned forward, ran her fat forefinger over the worn old volumes, and took out a battered blue-covered book. Scott? Oh, yes, said Uncle Henry, his eyes shining. The Stag at Eve. At least that's the way it sounded to Betsy. But when she took the book and looked to where Aunt Abigail pointed, she read it correctly, though in a timid, uncertain voice. She was proud to think that she could please a grown-up so much as she was evidently pleasing Uncle Henry. But the idea of reading aloud for people to hear, not for a teacher to correct, was unheard of. The stag at eve had drunk his fill, when danced the moon o'er a moment's rill. She began, and it was as though she had stepped into a boat and was swept off by a strong current. She did not know what all the words meant, and she could not pronounce a good many of the names, but nobody interrupted to correct her, and she read on and on, steadied by the strongly marked rhythm, drawing forward from one clanging, sonorous rhyme to another. Uncle Henry nodded his head in time to the rise and fall of her voice, and now and then stopped his work to look at her with bright, eager old eyes. He knew some of the places by heart, evidently, for once in a while his voice would join the little girls for a couplet or two. They chanted together thus: A moment listened to the cry that thickened as the chase drew nigh. Then, as the headmost foes appeared, with one brave bound the copse he cleared. At the last line, Uncle Henry flung his arm out wide, and the child felt as though the deer had made his great leap there right before her eyes. "I've seen him jump just like that," broke in Uncle Henry. "A 200 or 300 pound stag go up over a 4-foot fence just like a piece of thistledown in the wind." "Uncle Henry," asked Elizabeth Ann, "what is a copse?" "Oh, I don't know," said Uncle Henry indifferently. "Something in the woods must be, underbrush most likely. You can always tell words you don't know by the sense of the whole thing. Go on." And stretching forward free and far, the child's voice took up the chant again. She read faster and faster as it got more exciting. Uncle Henry joined in on, "For, jaded now and spent with toil, embossed with foam and dark with soil, while every gasp with sobs he drew, the laboring stag strained full in view." The little girl's heart beat fast. She fled along the next line, stumbling desperately over the hard words, but seeing the headlong chase through them clearly as through tree trunks in a forest. Uncle Henry broke in triumphant shout. The wily quarry shunned the shock and turned him from the opposing rock. Then, dashing down the darkness glen, soon lost to hound the hunter's ken. In the deep, wild nook his solitary refuge took. "Oh, my," cried Elizabeth Ann, laying down the book. "He got away, didn't he? I was so afraid he wouldn't." "I can just hear those dogs yelping, can't you?" said Uncle Henry. "Yelled on the view, the opening pack." "Sometimes you hear 'em like that on the slope of Hemlock Mountain, back of us when they get to running a deer." "What say we have some popcorn?" suggested Aunt Abigail. "Betsy, don't you want to pop us some?" "I never did," said the little girl, but in a less doubtful tone than she had ever used with that phrase so familiar to her. A dim notion was growing in her mind that the fact that she had never done a thing was no proof that she couldn't. "I'll show you," said Uncle Henry. He reached down a couple of ears of corn from a big yellow cluster hanging on the wall, and he and Betsy shoved them into the popper, popped it full of snowy white kernels, buttered it, salted it, and took it back to the table. It was just as she was eating her first ambrosial mouthful that the door opened and a fur-capped head was thrust in. A man's voice said, "Evening, folks. No, I can't stay. I was down at the village just now, and I thought I'd ask for any mail down our way." He tossed a newspaper and a letter on the table and was gone. The letter was addressed to Elizabeth Ann, and it was from Aunt Frances. She read it to herself, while Uncle Henry read the newspaper. Aunt Frances wrote that she had been perfectly horrified to learn that Cousin Molly had not kept Elizabeth Ann with her, and that she could never forgive her for such cruelty. And when she thought of her darling at Putney Farm, her blood ran cold. It positively did. It was too dreadful, but it couldn't be helped for any time now, because Aunt Harriet was really very sick. Elizabeth Ann would have to be a dear brave child, and endure it as best she could, and soon, oh, as soon as she ever could, Aunt Frances would come and take her away from them. "Don't cry too much, darling. It breaks my heart to think of you there. Try to be cheerful, dearest. Try to bear it for the sake of your distracted, loving Aunt Frances." Elizabeth Ann looked up from this letter and across the table at Aunt Abigail's rosy, wrinkled old face bent over her darning. Uncle Henry laid the paper down, took a big mouthful of popcorn, and beat time silently with his hand. When he could speak, he murmured, "100 dogs, big, deep, and strong, clattered in 100 steeds along." Old Shep woke up with a snort, and Aunt Abigail fed him a handful of popcorn. Little Eleanor stirred in her sleep, stretched, yawned, and nestled down into a ball again on the little girl's lap. Betsy could feel it in her own body, the rhythm vibration of the kitten's contented purr. Aunt Abigail looked up. "Finished your letter? I hope Harriet's no worse. What does Frances say?" Elizabeth Ann blushed a deep red and crushed the letter together in her hand. She felt ashamed, and she did not know why. Aunt Frances says, she began, hesitating. "She says Aunt Harriet is still pretty sick." She stopped, drew a long breath, and went on, "And she sends her love to you." Now, Aunt Frances hadn't done anything of the kind, so this was really a whopping fib. But Elizabeth Ann didn't care if it was. It made her feel less ashamed, though she didn't know why. She took another mouthful of popcorn and stroked Eleanor's back. Uncle Henry got up and stretched. "Time to go to bed, folks," he said, and as he wound the clock, Betsy heard him murmuring, "But when the sun his beacon red." And that's the end of that chapter.